Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Penn from thecreativepenn.com and today I'm here with Alastair Humphreys. Hi Al.
Hello.
Welcome back to the show. Just in case anyone doesn't know you, Alastair is an adventurer, an author of 10 books and a motivational speaker named as the National Geographic Adventurer of the Year 2012. He has cycled across the world, walked across India and the empty quarter desert, rode the Atlantic, run the Marathon des Sables, as well as going on many other micro-adventures. His latest book is My Midsummer Morning, Rediscovering a Life of Adventure. So, Al, you've been on the show twice before, 2009 and 2013. Can you believe it's been so long?
Wow, that's 10 years since the first one. That is ridiculous.
Oh my goodness, yeah, you would have been in my first batch, I guess, which is crazy. So I want to ask, I guess since we talked last 6 years, how has your writing process changed over time? Because there are people listening who might be on their first book, people who are on a later book, but with 10, what are your lessons learned?
The lessons learned are that writing books is really hard, and I continually curse that. So that hasn't seemed to change for me. I think the thing that has got massively easier was with having written several books is I now have an audience and I now have publishing options, and that takes a huge stress off me, knowing that if I sit down and write this book, someone will publish it, and that's quite a relief compared to when I began writing books. And increasingly, I have an audience who I'm familiar with, so I can, as I'm writing, I can be more confident that this is going to target a certain niche of people, and it'll be fine. So both of those things are real weights off my shoulder for actually sitting down and getting the book finished.
Well, and then we should point out you've been blogging. When did you start blogging?
Even longer ago than you, I reckon. 2001, before the word blog was invented.
Okay, so I was 2008, so you're pretty hardcore. But this is important. I mean, do you have any idea of how many words you've written on your blog, or in addition to the 10 books? Because that is how you've built an audience, isn't it?
Yeah, when I decided to start taking this kind of life seriously, I needed to find a way to get people to know who I was. And the way I decided to do that was via blogging. So I decided just to treat blogging like a half-time job. So half of my time was blogging, and I used to schedule them and write for a month in advance. And I've written nearly 2,000 blogs now on my website. So yeah, it takes vast amounts of time and effort to build up even a small little niche audience. But the blogging has been useful not only for telling people who I am, for improving SEO, getting my fingers in all sorts of pies around the internet, but also just for learning to become a better writer. You know, the two ways I think to be a good writer, one is to read a lot and the other is to write a lot. And eventually at the end of writing a lot, you can then sit down and start to write.
Yeah, and of course, Stephen King said that too, so great quote. Read a lot and write a lot.
I thought that was original. Did I steal it from Stephen King?
Yeah, it's one of his good ones.
His book, by the way, I'm sure you're well aware of, on writing, is brilliant. It's the only one of his I read because it's the only one that's not scary, but it's brilliant.
Yeah, and of course he has narrated that audiobook, and we're going to come back to that in a bit. So let's talk about this particular book. So My Midsummer Morning, you walked across Spain before you wrote this book. So for people who want to write while they're travelling, so maybe that is on an adventure, or there's lots of people who now, you know, I don't actually write much when I travel, but the process of writing while traveling is interesting. So how did you write while you were walking? Like, you know, when did you do it? And was it just scribbles? And tell us about that.
So I started, on all the trips I've ever done, I've always written diaries, partly just for personal interest, so I'll remember them later, partly to try and figure stuff out, partly because I have no friends and I'm on my own, and also increasingly because I'm trying to write a book. And the way I do it is quite old-fashioned, with a diary and a pen, and every time I sit down for lunch or in the evenings or in the morning or whatever, I just write, and I try and write as much as I possibly can, just churn down everything that's in my brain. The trips that I do are often involving me being in motion to somewhere. So if I suddenly have a genius idea, it's a bit annoying to stop and take off my rucksack. So I usually carry a very small little notebook and a little stub of pencil in my pocket. And as I'm writing along, as I'm walking, I just jot down little things like that. I found over time that's the best way for me to get stuff recorded. When I walked across India years ago and wrote a book about that, I tried to take my notes via audio. So I'd walk along doing audio recording, which led to vast amounts of me waffling away. And then I never got round to ever doing anything with that huge amounts of audio. So different things for different people. But I found that handwriting the diary, and then when I get home, one of the first jobs I do is just type up the whole diary, gradually starts to filter things in my head.
Wow. So you type it up when you get home, because it's so funny right now. I've probably got nearly 50 notebooks that I am trying to pull things out of my head and try and remember what notebook they're in. And I've never written up the whole thing, which is, you know, I've interviewed you for my other podcast, Books and Travel. But the process of revisiting 25 years later is very hard. So it's fascinating to hear you say that. That's crazy.
Yeah, I keep them up on my bookshelf here. I've got look, here it is. Here is Spain. Black notebook. This is my Spain book.
Is that a moleskin?
It's a budget version of a moleskin that I got free at a talk. But yeah, it's the same. That's like a moleskin type thing. And then this is the little one that I had in my pocket as I was walking along, which on the front says, "We wander for distraction, but we travel for fulfillment." And that has got very bad handwriting of me writing in pencil as I walk along. But yeah, and I find just typing the whole thing up straight away is a good way of just getting on with the process.
And when you're typing it up there, do you edit as you go, even with that first typing it up?
No, because at the moment, at that time, I don't know what the book is. I don't know what the story is. So it's just typing it up, which is a way really of just me reliving the trip and remembering stuff.
No, that's fascinating. So how do you, I was going to ask you about senses. So when you're writing things down, are you using sensory detail about the smells and the sounds and everything, or do you come back to that later?
No, I try to, and it depends on the how I'm feeling on the actual trip. Quite a lot of the time, the stuff I'm doing, I'm pretty knackered or scared or uncomfortable and not necessarily in the mood for writing anything particularly eloquent. So I just scribble down bits and bobs. But also I have a huge amount of time often in my trips when I'm just lying around with nothing to do. So evenings, and then I just try and brain dump. I just write and about factual stuff, any bits and bobs I've learned, sort of snippets of information, emotions, and then going through the five senses, just trying to capture everything that's around that. Because at the time, I don't know what's going to be useful and what isn't. But I've also got a terrible memory, so I need to try and just get as much of this reality down as possible.
Yeah, I know what you mean. So also, you're a photographer and you're a filmmaker. So how much do your pictures help your writing process, or are they for an entirely different thing?
No, they just, when I said memory, I thought that of exactly this point, which is that I also later on use my photos a lot for writing stuff, and particularly for the sort of set piece things, like I'm walking towards a castle on the hill. I sort of look at this picture and that helps me describe it more accurately. And video is fantastic for that as well, for the sounds that you get in video clips. So I quite often go back and do that. I also cheat as well by using Google Maps, the Street View. So I sort of street view my way along bits that I've walked, or the Spain book I've just written had to describe quite a lot of plazas where I stood and busked. So I've done quite a bit of Google Street View, looking around the plazas for details that I forgot that I can put in now and make it feel a bit more real.
That's a great tip, because of course a lot of those plazas look quite similar, lots of walls and a fountain in the middle.
Well, exactly. That's how they all start. Walls, fountains and a church, and it's blue sky and it's hot. And then to try and make it a bit more detailed. So, for example, one specific scene in the book, I've described this cafe that's across the plaza, which I remember, but I couldn't for the life of me have any details. So now I'd be able to put the thing that it said on the shutters to just make it much more present. And I don't think that's cheating.
No, well, it's interesting you mentioned cheating there. And what is cheating? How much of it is I've used the word true before, but, you know, what is true? What is cheating for you? Like, you seem to have a view on that.
I find it a very interesting thing with travel writing, because it's not like writing fiction where you can just throw in a dragon and a dinosaur whenever you want. I'm trying to write about the trips that I've done, and occasionally I'm tempted to throw in a few dinosaurs just because it's a bit boring and it would liven up my text. But I feel in terms of truth that I never want to make up episodes, so I never make up stories of stuff that didn't happen. But I often amalgamate a lot of different truths, so a lot of different memories of, say, campsites, or perhaps different individual people I've met. I often amalgamate all of these things into one nugget of a story, which serves to tell more accurately how the experience was at the time, and in a way to make it more truthful, not to make it more factual, but to make it more truthful. And all the books that I've written, the travel narrative books, have always done that. This Spain book was the most I've ever done that, in terms of chopping all sorts of stuff up, chopping up the chronologies, mixing things around, putting things in different orders in order to try and get to a broader truth of how the whole experience was for me.
No, that's very cool. So also, you mentioned that there are a lot of times when you're just, you know, tired, you know, resting, whatever. And you, in the book, you say travel has so much tedium in between the highlights, quote. So what are your tips on editing memoir to make it more engaging for the reader?
Oh, I really struggled with this, with writing a book about walking, because the essence of most of my days was just plodding down hot footpaths, really hot, feeling a bit hungry. And that was pretty much what happened most of the time. If I wrote all of that, it'd be really boring. If I left it all out, it would then mean that the highlights and the lowlights were sort of out of context. So I tried my best to give a flavour of the repetitiveness, but in a non-repetitive way. And the way I've chosen to do that, it goes back a bit to this chopping up of the truths, is that I've broken the book up more into chapters about themes. So I have, for example, a chapter about setting up camp, which is all of the different memories of setting up camp bundled into one story. I have a section about the pain of walking and the slowness of walking, which is all of the different memories and impressions of that distilled down to a chunk. So perhaps in a way it's taken from my blogging background of trying to just write 1,000-word set pieces about a single topic. And quite a few of my book chapters are probably done in that sort of style.
And you did this trip almost 2 years ago now, I think. 3? No. Oh, what? Time just flies by, doesn't it? It's crazy. So 3 years ago you did this trip, and I know how long you've been editing this. So I just love you to give people a sense of your frustration with editing. Like you said, it's really hard to write a book, but yet you've you've cycled around the world and walked all over the place. You know, like, what is hard for you, really?
We've had interesting arguments about whether I should keep on polishing and polishing and polishing for eternity, or whether I should just put the book out there and get on and write a better one next time, which I think is a really interesting round and round argument. But I've definitely gone for the polishing and polishing of this. One of the reasons there's 3 reasons the book has taken a long time. One is because I've gone with a traditional publisher rather than a self-publisher, and they still think that dinosaurs roam the earth, and therefore the whole process is incredibly slow. They haven't yet realised the internet exists. 2, I've really tried to polish this book because it's a book that personally means a lot to me, so I've really wanted to make it as good as I possibly can for my own personal reasons. I think for commercial reasons, I should have probably chucked it out into the world a year ago and got on with something else, but personally I wanted to really polish it. And the 3rd reason it's taken so long is because it's a hazard of travel writing, is you don't know what's going to happen. And in this case, nothing really happened. So I went to Spain to walk through Spain for a month, following an old book, busking, which is a nice idea for a book. I set off and the trip was brilliant. I had a wonderful time and absolutely nothing bad happened at all. So I came home and I wrote the story from my diary of what happened, which was basically me just walking around, eating sandwiches and playing the violin. I wrote that book and I sent it to my publisher, and he quite accurately said, it's quite nice, but absolutely nothing happens. So I then had a choice of either scrapping the project or doing a complete overhaul of it and completely changing the structure and the theme and the point of the book to be much more than a travel narrative. And I decided to do that, and that then made it take a lot longer as well.
Well, it's interesting because, and you're right, it is a more of a personal transformation book than a sort of, you know, some of the Summit Everest type massive achievement things, which is interesting. So part of your transformation is you include a lot of personal memories and personal narrative with your current life, you know, your kids, your marriage, and how things have changed for you in your life as an adventurer. So I think it's a very personal book. So how much of that, how hard was that, I guess, to write? And if people want to write memoir, how far should they go with that?
And this whole extra facet to the book was the complete rewriting. And I've essentially lived two very different lives, two very separate lives. I live my life as a public person, so a writer and Instagrammer and blogger and all that sort of stuff, Adventure Al, and then I have real life me, which is what I do in my normal life with normal stuff, which is, I think, of no interest and also no relevance to the rest of the world. So I've always kept them very separate. So I went to Spain very much as Adventure Al, and the film that I made of this is interesting because you can't retrospectively change a film. So the film of Spain is just, here's Al having an adventure in Spain. And consequently, it's a lovely little film, but fairly bland because it's just me walking through Spain having a nice time. And that was the book that got rejected. So then I had to think of a way to make it more interesting. And I decided, therefore, to just be honest about the other side of my life as well, my real life, and how the struggle I've had between trying to be normal me, normal guy, husband, father, and also Adventure Al, tough guy, adventurer, doing stuff. And the struggle I've had between the two, which has been a huge personal one in my life for the last 9 years. And I decided to tie those two things together into the book. To answer your question then of writing memoir, I think the way to do it well is to be as honest as you dare and as honest as you're possibly comfortable with, and then a bit beyond. And I think my book got better the more honest and vulnerable I made myself, which is a difficult thing to do, but simply in terms of, if you want to write a good book, then you just have to be honest and lay it on the line. And you, as a reader, will know that yourself from reading books. The memoirs that grip you are the ones that really go deep and honest and vulnerable.
And I know a lot of, I think it's partly your fault. And also another friend of mine, Rachel Heron, who's written a memoir. And, you know, I've found myself starting to write one too. And the question that comes up in my head is, people that you write about, how far have you gone with asking permission for some of the things you've written? Have you gone for permission or have you gone for apology?
It's easier to seek forgiveness than permission is a great rule for being a traveller. I think perhaps less so for being a memoir writer. So in terms of my book, the only relevant people really was my family. So, and I thought it would be a bit of a recipe for disaster to write a book about domestic dispute without first discussing it with my wife. So I've gone for, I wrote it all and then talked it over with my wife and got to a point that she just said she was happy for me to write whatever I wanted to write. But I definitely think that was important to do. In all the books I ever write, I always just change, just as a default setting, I just change names and locations of anyone I ever write about, which simplifies even the smallest squabbles or arguments you might have. But in terms of the big stuff, I think, I just think it'd be rude to not do it the right way, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I've read the book; it's fantastic, and there's nothing offensive. Like, you know, I know some people write memoir as a sort of they shouldn't write for revenge, but you do read some memoirs and a lot of it's revenge. But no, just to point out to the listeners, your book's not like that. But when we use real people in our writing, it is an important point.
Yeah, very much so. And yeah, you're right. My book is full of love and trying to do the right things for the right people, but it has the struggles that I think everyone has in their life, the conflict between family and ambition and individuality and all those struggles I think everyone has. I think what I found hard in my book, so I'm not writing for revenge in a way, but I'm certainly writing about a life that at times is not perfect, and writing about a private life in a public way. I think you just need to be sensitive and understanding about doing that. But on the other hand, if you want to write a good book, you need to pour out all the dirt and be as juicy and as angry as you possibly can. So there's a conflict in that for sure.
Yeah, well, I think you did a great job on this. And I think that's partly why it has taken 3 years. So, good on you for ignoring me. But let's talk about publishing, because, of course, when you first came on the show, like I think 2009 or something like that, when we talked about There Are Other Rivers, which was your India book, you self-published that, and you've done lots of different publishing forms over the years. So what are your thoughts right now on publishing options for, I guess, people writing in the travel niche particularly?
I think that there's different ways to publish that suit different people at different times. So I don't think there's a hard and fast right way to do things. So I currently have a normal, proper big publisher, HarperCollins, who are doing the Spain book. And that's great because they'll make a nice, big, flashy hardcover, and they've got an editor and they've got all those sort of things. And I can show off to people I've got a proper publisher. So that's great. The downside is the constant frustration I have with trying to get things done my way and done things the way I think the 21st century of publishing demands. So that's very frustrating. I've also published books with a tiny publisher, which is great because they do much of that sort of stuff if you haven't yet got your foot in the door for a bigger publisher. So there's been a time and a place for that in my life. The main caveat I'd suggest to anyone doing that is to pay a bit of attention to their contracts rather than just signing anything just so they can get a book published. That has caused me a lot of pain. And then as we speak, I'm actually now writing another book that I'm going back to doing as self-published, just so I can do it in a more quirky, independent, less conventional sort of way. So I have no set preference for what I want to do with a book. It's very much a case-by-case basis.
Let's talk about the audiobook then, as we circling back to, as I mentioned, about Stephen King narrating his book. And you've narrated My Midsummer Morning, and also There Are Other Rivers recently. And so how has that been? Why did you decide to self-narrate, and what did you learn?
Well, I've been wanting to get an audiobook done for almost 10 years now, which links slightly to my last answer about contracts and annoyance, which I won't just go down. But finally, I've got around to doing it because audiobooks are a huge thing these days. They tap into people who don't read normal books, and it's just a different slice of pie. So I've been really eager to do it, and I now enjoy listening to audiobooks myself. So I wanted to get on and do it. So I've got two books done in two different ways. The My Midsummer Morning, it's just HarperCollins tell me, we've got this audiobook, people turn up at there, do the thing, off you go. And then it'll all turn up out, released at some point. The India book, which is self-published, I had to find myself a place to do it. And I found a great guy called Greg, Sound Shack near Cheltenham, who was brilliant. He's just a freelance guy. I turned up at his house. We went to his garage, which is a sound studio, and I just sat down and read the book all day. It was a difficult but simple process, I think. It was quite exhausting to do, really exhausting, in fact, and quite time-consuming. And I also found it quite agonizing. I never look back at my old books ever. Once I've written them, they're just gone. So I was now opening this book, which I haven't looked inside for about 8 years. I was absolutely dreading it. As I started to read, I was thinking, if this is going to be terrible, it's going to be awful. So I was really dreading that. But I was pleased. It was actually quite a good book. So I think it was a good experience to do, and definitely worth doing. It really wasn't much of a hassle at all.
And again, I want to, I've talked about this, about how much hard work it is. Like, it takes stamina to read all day, doesn't it?
Oh, it really is. It's really tiring. You get quite a sore throat, and you get consciously that you start to sort of lose a bit of enthusiasm. You have to have breaks. So I think it would be wise to not try and rush it through. Best to spread it out over a chunk of time so that you can be doing it in an upbeat and enthusiastic kind of way. Having said that, I'm also quite competitive and stubborn, so I also wanted to bash out the entire book in one day, which I did manage to do, but it was quite hard work.
Yeah, no, that's good. And personally, I wouldn't do it all in one day. But then you're also a professional speaker, and you also narrate your own films. So if people watch any of your videos, they're going to hear you speaking as well. So how much do you think your professional speaking ability or training has helped with doing the audiobook?
I think it helped massively that I do a lot of speaking, and that I'm regularly I do lots of presentation things where I sort of have to read out to an audience, and so therefore you get the pitch and tone and things right. So I think that helped hugely. I'm good at reading, and I know there are quite a lot of people who just find reading harder. I have a friend who's doing an adventure book, and he just acknowledges that he's good at writing, but he's not good enough at reading to narrate it. So I think it depends on what you're like. I think also it probably depends on your voice. I think some people have got voices that are easier to hear. If you've got a real hardcore accent, you might struggle with getting a wide listenership from different countries. So I think there are quite a few things to consider before doing it yourself. But on the other hand, surely if you can, it's the best thing to hear the author telling their story in their own voice. And then you just have to decide what to do about the accents. Because my book was about walking across India. I thought, do I start to try and do an Indian accent? I thought, no, that is just going to be an appalling thing to do. But Spain, I quite fancy my Spanish accent, so who knows?
Oh, well, there we go. That is interesting. So talking about speaking, so I've heard you speak, and I know people ask you questions about if I do an adventure, can I just get a book deal and that will give me £1 million, and thus I am going to just do it for the rest of my life. So what's the reality if people want to get into travel writing as a career? Is it based on book sales, or what is the model of a travel writer, entrepreneur, adventurer?
Okay. I think the first thing to do if you want to be a travel writer is to go traveling. I think quite a lot of people worry about getting publishers and agents and stuff like that before they're doing anything. And I think really the thing to do is just get yourself out the front door and go do something massive, crazy, exciting, quirky, whatever it is, but something that you personally are genuinely very, very excited and passionate about. Go do that, write your diary, and come home. Once you've come home, write your book. It'll be absolutely rubbish. So spend a few months writing an absolutely terrible first draft. Then rip it all up, rewrite it again. Gradually, you're starting to get to the point where you've got something that's a little bit good. But still, no one knows who you are. So that's why I spent years building up a blog audience. These days, a social media audience, YouTube audience. So I've been working away at this now for getting on towards 2 decades of more or less full-time travel writing adventure, and I still can no way live from my books, which I know you will berate me for all sorts of reasons about being terrible, but the reality is I make my living out of speaking, giving talks about the travel stuff that I do, and these days making films about the travel things for brand partners. I'm a long way off actually earning a living from writing itself. So I think anyone needs to bear that in mind. And I think really, even if you somehow fluke yourself one massive hit, in the travel sector, you're not going to be retiring on that for sure. So I think writing needs to be part of a bigger portfolio of things that you're interested in doing, which may well include a full-time job that happens to give you 2 months off a year to go traveling, and you write your book in the evenings. I think that's as sensible an option as any.
No, that's fantastic. And of course, this show is all about multiple streams of income.
I need to start listening to this podcast rather than just being on it once a decade.
No, No, that's super. So one last question. For those people watching on the video, they can see what's behind you. And there's a globe and there's lots of books. And
hopefully just out of view, there's a massive poster of myself, which is ridiculous. I try and get that just out of sight. Yeah.
But I wondered if you'd tell us about your writing space, because I think it is quite special and something you worked hard to get to. So tell us about your shed, or as you call it in the book, your oasis and teleporter.
Yes, this is my shed, which I love very, very much. And I've been writing in here for 4 or 5 years now. I actually bought it when I wrote a book called Micro Adventures, which was my biggest ever advance. That's when I hit the big time with my first ever big publisher, and I spent my entire advance on a shed, which gives you an idea of the sort of wealth level of my travel writing. But I built this shed from the advance from that. I've wallpapered it with all the maps that I use for writing the Micro Adventures, and I've gradually, as you can see, filled it with travel type things and books, and I find having a space that feels inspiring to me really helpful for actually getting on to write a book. And having a load of books that I love on the shelves, I take them down and they give me ideas for other sort of things. I find it really, really useful. I find it very helpful for separating my real life from my working life and coming here with the attitude of thinking, right, I'm here now, I need to get on and do some work and write a book, rather than what I've spent a lot of time doing, which is, oh, I'm a writer, therefore I'll sit around and drink coffee all day and do absolutely nothing. So I found it very, very handy. On the other hand, I really would caution against thinking that you need to have a proper writing shed in order to write a book. Some bloke called Stephen King wrote a good book about writing, and he wrote his first book down in the laundry room. So you definitely don't need a fancy shed to write a book in, but it certainly helps.
Yeah, we should say Stephen King was working in the laundry as he was in the laundry room. He wasn't just, he was like working nights in the laundry. Yeah. But no, I think you're right. And it just reminded me of the Virginia Woolf, quote, or the book, a room of her own. I know it's her own, but because you have kids and a family, so having a space that's separate from like the kitchen table, I think is fantastic. Right, so tell people where they can find you and your books and films and everything you do online.
Well, thanks to 18 years of blogging, it should be quite easy to find on the Google. Alastair Humphreys will take you to my website, and Twitter and Instagram, Facebook and YouTube. I'm active on all of those sort of things. And then the book is going to be on Amazon, on my website, and all other websites like that.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your time, Al. That was great.
Thanks for having me again.